Hi, my name is Phil Cooke, and I'm thrilled to be here teaching in this session today. And I want to first start by saying thank you to Dr. Brenda, who arranged for all this. She's been just a super fan and supporter, and she's fantastic. I like her on so many levels, and she's been really great for being instrumental in putting all this together. And we were talking recently about what I should speak about and what would help you the most. And one of the things that I really felt I should share is about how we should be leading our congregations, leading our ministries, leading our teams coming out of the pandemic. You know, it's interesting in the Black community particularly. I traveled throughout the pandemic. I work with churches and ministry organizations for a living. And during the pandemic, I was on flights where I was the only guy on the plane. And I got to see a lot of what was going on out there. And our team at Cooke Media Group in Los Angeles have been helping churches and ministries live stream for years and years, even before the pandemic. But I got to see what was happening out there. And I know the pandemic hurt the Black community in particular. And I think recovery has been very slow and very difficult. And maybe some of you are leading congregations or leading ministry organizations or outreaches that are still struggling because of trying to make that comeback. And so I wanted to share a few things that I'm seeing on churches that are really growing, churches that are getting back into shape and doing some amazing things out there and making an impact. And so I just wanted to go over a list of a few thoughts that I think would really, really help. One of the things I think we need to be aware of coming out of the pandemic is that this is the most distracted age in the history of the world. I think it's very important for you to understand that. Some studies indicate the typical person today sees about 10,000 media messages every single day. They're being overwhelmed. In fact, for those of you still reading newspapers, when you read 7 days of a daily newspaper, you've read more information than a person just 100 years ago read during their entire lifetime. So that's our grandparents or great-grandparents. That's not a very long span of time. And you're seeing that we've gone from a lifetime of reading what would amount to 7 daily newspapers to being overwhelmed with information. We're literally being flooded in the choices we have and distractions from social media to email to text messaging to phone calls. It's literally overwhelming. So in that world, we have to think, how do we capture people's attention? So one study, a famous Microsoft study came out recently that indicated when you meet someone for the first time, you decide what you think of that person in the first 4 to 8 seconds. Now think about that. You haven't had time to really get to know them, hear much of anything they have to say, but hey, we've got other things to do. I've got my text messages going, I got my email, I got to check my phone calls. We're so distracted that we've just changed our behavior that we've started making decisions within 4 to 8 seconds. Now, for a pastor or ministry leader, one of the things that means is I'm glad your sermon is anointed. I'm glad your music or your worship is fantastic. But in an 8-second world, what's the parking experience like at your church? In an 8-second world, what's the lobby look like in your church? In an 8-second world, who's the first person a new visitor meets when they walk in the door? Because I can pretty much tell you in the world and the culture that we live in today, a new visitor has already decided what they think of your church long before they actually get to their seat. So we need to start thinking in terms of that 8-second filter. That's why when I write a book, I spend as much time coming up with a cover design and a title for that book as I do writing the book itself. We have to capture people's attention more effectively. And I think that's incredibly important for ministry leaders, pastors to know as we emerge from this pandemic and we start making an impact in the culture out there. And one of the things is that during the pandemic, I want to congratulate you, first of all, because so many of you stepped up when churches were shut down. When churches were shut down, you stepped up, you did live streaming, you started doing Instagram videos, short videos on YouTube. I just want to congratulate you, first of all, for stepping up. In fact, I can tell you, I live in Los Angeles, and out my office window, I see Universal Studios, Walt Disney Studios, Warner Brothers Studios, the Cartoon Network. And I can tell you for those 2 years of the pandemic, those were ghost towns. Hollywood was not producing anything. But you know what? Churches stood up and they were producing all kinds of incredible media content for people all over the world. for those 2 years, the church produced more media than Hollywood did, which I think is a remarkable thing. But now that we are emerging, so many churches are pulling back from their online presence. And I would just encourage you to keep that up, keep it going. Because for me, it's not an either or situation. Certainly, I'd like everybody to show up on Sunday. We want everybody to show up on Sunday. I'm all for fellowship. But I know that there are certain people that will only engage with your church online. So let's not discourage those people. Let's not make it either or in the building or online. Let's make it both and. However people choose to engage with your church, let's do something really amazing. Let's give them an incredibly amazing experience, because I just really think that's so very, very important that we're able to do that. So I just encourage you, stay in there, stay in the game, keep doing things that are going to help people engage with the gospel more effectively. Now, one interesting thing I would tell you is, from my research and the work that we do with churches around the country, is people will check you out online before they ever come to visit. Almost everybody these days wants to check you out online before they come to visit. And in that world, your website needs to be amazing. I'm shocked at the number of church websites that are frankly terrible. And yet, if that's the thing that most people use to decide whether or not they want to visit you, your website maybe ought to be the best thing you do. So I would just encourage you, the power of online is amazing. Keep in mind that the Apostle Paul used the technology of his day, which was letters, to build the foundation of the early church. I think it would be wrong for us to not use the technology of our day to advance the cause of the gospel. So I just would encourage you, keep in the game when it comes to your online ministry, your live streaming. You just never know how that could impact people, or who out there is watching. I know so many people whose lives were transformed because they engaged with the church online. They got saved, they got healed, they got delivered. So I think that's very, very, very important. Also, a couple other things that I would encourage you to do is, when you think about design for your church, whether you think about logos, whether you think about website design, whether you think about brochures, things like that, don't be afraid to be contemporary. So many times churches will come to me and say, Phil, we really want to be more contemporary. We want to reach younger people, but we're just afraid we're going to turn off the older crowd. And I tell them, the older crowd is the rock and roll generation. They're the blues generation. Keep in mind, Willie Nelson's 89. Tina Turner is 83. Bob Dylan's 81. They grew up listening to that music. They grew up listening to Jimi Hendrix and Marvin Gaye. They grew up listening to the Platters, the Temptations, the Grateful Dead, the Stones. They're not going to be freaked out over your new logo. They're not going to be freaked out over your very contemporary website design. They can handle it. The older people in your church are the rock and roll generation, so don't count them out. Don't think they're the grandparents of a previous age, because they certainly are not. So I just say those things up front. Now, let me give you a couple tips that I think are really important too as you emerge from the pandemic, what you might be thinking of as leaders for strengthening your church. Number one, I think finding great talent is more important than ever. I think whether it's your music department, your education department, your communications department, if you have an online pastor, a video person, a communications director at your church, if you're big enough to do that, I'll tell you, talent really matters in this day and age. Certainly, we want people who are committed to the gospel and committed to the church and committed to the cause of Christ. But at the same time, we want people really, really talented, because in that world where people are so distracted and we have to capture their attention quickly, we need creativity. We really need creative people in place, and I think it's important. Another thing to think about is your team, the people you're hiring on your team, they're not just looking for a job. This generation is looking for a purpose. And so as a leader, it's more important than ever to instill in your ministry team a sense of powerful purpose. They'll work. I've discovered younger people today will work for less money if they have a great purpose, if they feel like they're making a difference in the world. So it's important that as a leader, you're constantly infusing your team with their sense of purpose. I would also encourage you to understand the difference between, when it comes to the structure of your church or your ministry, understand the difference between your organizational structure and your communication structure. Certainly, organizational structure matters. Who reports to who matters. Who the boss is matters, and who runs various departments. All that matters. But when it comes to communication, I would encourage you to throw that out the window. Give you a great example. If, say, a designer on your team is working on a new logo, if they have to go through your organizational structure to get approvals all the way up to the pastor or the ministry leader, it could take months. Because everybody that is supposed to approve it along the way is going to add their 2 cents, and he's going to have to go back and change it. By the time the pastor or the ministry leader sees it, forget it, it's going to be something completely different. So when it comes to communication, allow your team to reach out to anybody they need to reach out to get the information they need. That is so important in a successful organization. Communication structure should be fluid. It should be open. People should be able to reach out and talk to anybody in the group. Don't let titles get in the way. Don't let big offices get in the way. Let your people get to who they need to find out the information they need at that moment, because that's incredibly, incredibly important. I would say something else that you should think about probably is learn to instill trust in your team. This is really important to me. I think as we come out of the pandemic, team members, employees, even your congregation is really looking for a sense of deep trust. And I think probably more than any other time in our lifetime, people are looking to trust a leader. And let me give you a couple key things to think about when it comes to instilling trust in your team. I think number one, just be real. This is the time to stop the hype. As ministry leaders, very often we think we have to be so hyped up, we have to be so enthusiastic, we have to, be out there pumping stuff all the time. Let me tell you, this generation, they push back. This is the most marketed to, promoted, and advertised to generation in the history of the world. They can see a con a mile away. So this is not the time to be hyped up, be overconfident. This is the time to be real. Be real with your team. It's so important. I would also say stop hiding your mistakes. Trust me, your team knows your mistakes. Your congregation knows your mistakes. Don't try to hide your mistakes. Get them out there for everybody to see. Make fun of them in the pulpit. Have some fun with it, because that will endear them to you and create an amazing sense of trust with your team. And finally, I would say create a culture where it's actually safe to fail. I just think that's really important. Create a culture where your team can try new things without worrying about being humiliated or embarrassed or yelled at. We want your team to be pioneering, to be stretching the tent poles, to be going out in new places and doing amazing work for God in your church and your ministry. So give them an environment where it's safe to fail. I like to tell pastors to, think in terms of starting a research and development lab at your church. Have a group of people who their purpose is to fail because they're trying something new all the time. Certainly you don't want to build a culture of failure. I tell my team, you can fail once at something, but then you better learn from it and move on. But we want them that first time to try new things and be open to failure. I think it's so incredibly important. Another thing I think for leaders during this time of coming out of COVID is be more accessible to your team. Be more accessible to your team. You know what? So often pastors, particularly older pastors of really large churches, I know you're busy, I know you have things to do. However, don't be cut off from your team. Make them feel like they can come in and share ideas with you, share problems with you, share challenges with you. Be accessible to your team. And if you can do that, they will walk through fire for you. They will do remarkable, remarkable things for you. And the last thing I would say is don't be afraid of leading during times of ambiguity. Right now, I think there's a time of real ambiguity in this country. We're seeing so many things go wrong, so many things go in the wrong direction. We're in this inflationary time. We're struggling culturally out there. There's cultural wars going on, and it's a real time of questions and ambiguity. This is your moment to step up as a leader. I always believe that crisis can build great leaders. And so during crisis, the real leaders stand up, and I would encourage you to do that. And let me say, I said the last thing, but let me say one more thing that I think it's important. You probably remember that as we went into to COVID and the church lockdowns, the interesting thing was every night on the news, they all said there's going to be a new normal when this is over. Things are going to change. Things are going to be different. And we had that pounded into our head night after night. Now, you know as a leader that getting people to change is one of the hardest things you'll ever do as a leader. People hate change. I've tried to get ministries and churches to change over the years, and it's just very, very difficult. People hate to change. I read one study that indicated that open heart surgery patients, literally within a year or two of their open heart surgery, go back to their old lifestyle, eating fried foods, drinking, smoking, all the things that got them forced them into open heart surgery to begin with. People, the threat of death doesn't even make most people change. So it's really hard. However, throughout this pandemic, that's all we've heard. Things are going to be different. There's going to be a new normal. Things are going to change. So as we've been coming out of this over the last year or so, I'm telling pastors, people are not only ready for change, they're expecting change. We're coming out of this environment, and when they come back to your church, they're expecting change. So, as a leader, here's the most important advice I can give you. Whatever changes you want to make, and if you're a pastor or ministry leader, I know you've been thinking about a lot of changes in your church or ministry. This is the moment to do it. It may be the order of service. It may be painting the sanctuary. It may be changing your staff. It could be a million different things. This is the time to do it. And I really believe the window is closing. You know, we may be within a month or so away from people reverting and going back to the way they always were, where they hate change. But I'll tell you, this is the moment. You want to change the name of your church or the name of your ministry, this is the moment to do it. Change your logo, this is the moment to do it. You know, we have all kind of jokes about, you know, the Baptists have a joke that if they don't worry about planting churches, all they have to do is change the color of carpet, and half the church will leave and start a new church. There are things like that are interesting, that are funny. However, I do believe that there's anything you want to change, this is the moment to do it. So go back after this session, go back after this meeting, and think of all the things that you've probably wanted to change over the last number of years at your church. And I would say this is the moment to pull the string to do that, because I think it's so incredibly, incredibly important. So I would just say, is coming out of COVID, coming out of this pandemic, you know, we've been a couple of years now out of it. I think that this is the time to rethink your leadership. This is the time to rethink your church, your ministry. This is the time to do the bold, visionary moves that God has always called you to, you've always wanted to make. This is the time to actually do it. Because I believe if you can step up and do that, I think suddenly people will see such an excitement happening in your church, such a difference happening in your church, such a new thing happening in your church. They're going to want to come. They're going to want to visit. They're going to want to engage online, and that'll hopefully lead them to want to come. And by the way, the very last thing I'll say is, when it comes to that online audience, treat them with the same respect as you do your congregation. Because that online audience is a legitimate congregation. Talk to them. Look at that camera. Welcome them to the service. Make them feel at home. And if you can do that, that's going to make them want to come and visit you even more. So I'm grateful. What you guys have been through these last number of years through the pandemic and trying to come out of COVID has just been amazing. And I'm so grateful for your vision and your leadership during this time. And I just think now's the time to step up to a new level of ministry and open the doors to what God can actually do at your church.